She was 18 and alone in the world. After the papers were signed, and the small house that had once smelled of her mother's bread and her father's linseed oil was sold to cover debts she had never made, Elara Wynne was left with nothing. Nothing but the clothes on her back, a canvas satchel holding a dead man's whittling knife, and $2 silver. And with those $2, she bought a ruined cabin on a forgotten spur of Whisperwind Ridge, a place the townsfolk of Cutter's Hollow claimed was cursed, a place where a stonemason had built a home for love, lost everything to death, and then sat down in his chair one winter and simply never stood up again. No one had set foot inside that cabin in 20 years. No one wanted to. But Elara Wynne had nowhere else to go. What she did not know, what no one in that valley could have told her, was that behind the cold stones of the hearth, sealed beneath a slab of granite laid by a dead man's hands, was a secret that would connect her to a promise made before she was born. A promise between her father and a ghost. A story of craft, sorrow, and a kindness that had been waiting 2 decades in the dark for the right pair of hands to find it. This is that story. She was 18 and alone in the world. After the papers were signed, and the small house that had once smelled of her mother's bread and her father's linseed oil was sold to cover debts she had never made, Elara Wynne was left with nothing. Nothing but the clothes on her back, a canvas satchel holding a dead man's whittling knife, and $2 silver. And with those $2, she bought a ruined cabin on a forgotten spur of Whisperwind Ridge, a place the townsfolk of Cutter's Hollow claimed was cursed. A place where a stonemason had built a home for love, lost everything to death, and then sat down in his chair one winter and simply never stood up again. No one had set foot inside that cabin in 20 years. No one wanted to, but Elara Wynne had nowhere else to go. What she did not know, what no one in that valley could have told her, was that behind the cold stones of the hearth, sealed beneath a slab of granite laid by a dead man's hands, was a secret that would connect her to a promise made before she was born. A promise between her father and a ghost. A story of craft, sorrow, and a kindness that had been waiting 2 decades in the dark for the right pair of hands to find it. This is that story. If you find meaning in stories of resilience and quiet strength, consider subscribing to our channel for more tales of finding home in the most unexpected places. Elara Wynne was born in the autumn of 1872 in the small, hard-working valley town of Cutter's Hollow, Colorado. It was a place defined by the sharp scent of pine sawdust carried on the morning wind, and the distant rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoing off the granite walls of the canyon. The town sat in the palm of a narrow valley, hemmed in on 3 sides by mountains so tall their peaks held snow well into June. A single road ran through its center, rutted by wagon wheels and lined with false-fronted buildings. A general store, a land office, a saloon with a crooked sign, and a small white church whose bell could be heard all the way to the tree line. It was not a place that appeared on any important map, It was the kind of town that existed because the mountains had timber and the rivers had trout, and men were stubborn enough to build lives in places that did not particularly want them. Elara's father, Tobias Wynne, was one of those stubborn men. He was a logger by trade, a man whose hands were as broad and calloused as oak bark, scarred across every knuckle, yet gentle enough to mend a bird's broken wing with a splint made from a matchstick. He stood 6 feet tall in his boots and moved through the forest with the quiet sureness of a man who understood that the wilderness was not his enemy, but his employer, and that respect was the only currency it accepted. He had come to Cutter's Hollow from Pennsylvania at the age of 20, following the timber west the way other men followed gold. He never found wealth. What he found instead was a 2-room house with a leaking roof at the edge of town, a steady job with the Consolidated Lumber Company, and a woman named Lenora. Lenora Wynne had come from the hill country of Appalachia, from a hollow so remote that the nearest neighbor was a 2-hour walk through rhododendron thickets. She arrived in Cutter's Hollow with a satchel of seeds wrapped in waxed paper, a Bible with pressed flowers between its pages, and a heart full of quiet, unshakable patience. She was a small woman, fine-boned, with dark hair she wore in a single braid down her back, and hands that were never still. She could make a garden bloom on the rockiest patch of soil. She could take a handful of dried beans, a scrap of salt pork, and a sprig of wild thyme, and produce a soup that made the small house feel like a cathedral. Elara grew up in that 2-room house, and her childhood was not one of wealth, but of deep, unspoken love. The floors were bare pine, scrubbed white with lye soap. The walls were chinked logs that let in thin blades of cold air on winter nights. The furniture was rough and handmade, but the house was always warm, always filled with the smell of baking bread. Drying herbs hung in bundles from the ceiling joists, and the linseed oil Tobias used to keep his tools from rusting. Love in that house was not spoken. It was demonstrated. It was measured in the way Tobias would come home from the timber stand at dusk, his wool shirt dark with sweat, and place a perfectly formed pine cone on the kitchen table beside Elara's plate without a word. It was measured in the way Lenora would sit on the porch in the long summer evenings, braiding wildflowers, columbine and Indian paintbrush and tiny white asters into her daughter's hair while the light faded from gold to violet behind the peaks. They did not have much, but what they had, they held with both hands. The object Elara treasured most from that time was a simple thing. It was her mother's locket, not a locket of gold or silver, but a small, smooth pendant of polished river stone, pale gray with a single vein of white quartz running through it like a frozen river. Lenora had found the stone herself in the creek bed behind the house, had spent evenings smoothing it with fine sand until it gleamed, and had asked the town's leather worker to set it on a thin, braided cord. Inside the locket, for it opened on a tiny copper hinge, there was no photograph. Photographs were expensive things, rare things, things that belonged to people in cities. Instead, Lenora had placed inside a single pressed forget-me-not, its petals still holding their pale blue even after years of being kept in the dark. When Alara asked why that flower, why not a rose or a daisy or one of the bright columbines that grew wild on the hillsides, Lenora had smiled and touched her daughter's cheek. "Because it asks the only thing worth asking," she said. "Remember me." Elara was 9 years old when the fever came through the valley. It came in the autumn of 1881. Not with any announcement or warning, but like a silent winter wind slipping under doors and through the cracks in window frames. It started at the lumber camp upriver, where men lived in close quarters in bunkhouses that smelled of wet wool and tobacco. Within a week, it had moved down into the town. The doctor, the only doctor within 40 miles, fell sick himself on the 3rd day and was dead by the 5th. Lenora was taken first. She had been tending to a neighbor's child, carrying a pot of broth through the rain, and by the time she returned home, her skin was hot to the touch, and her eyes had the glassy, unfocused look that everyone in the valley had learned to dread. Tobias carried her to bed and did not leave her side. He bathed her forehead with cool water from the creek. He held her hand through the long, terrible nights when her breathing became shallow and ragged, a sound like wind through a broken fence. On the 4th morning, just as the first gray light came through the window, Lenora turned her head on the pillow, looked at Tobias with perfect clarity, and said his name, just his name. Then she closed her eyes. Tobias did not weep. He sat very still for a long time, holding her hand. His broad shoulders curved inward as though some essential beam inside him had cracked. Then he stood, walked to the kitchen table where Alara sat wrapped in a blanket, her small face white with fear, and knelt beside her. He did not tell her that everything would be all right. Tobias Wynne was not a man who lied to his daughter. He simply held her, his big, calloused hands pressing her head against his chest, and let her feel the slow, steady beat of his heart. 1 week later, Tobias was dead. The fever had taken him differently than it had taken Lenora. Where she had burned, he had simply faded. He grew weaker by the hour, as though the sickness understood that the only way to bring down a man that strong was slowly, by degrees, the way water wears down stone. On his last night, he sat propped up in the same bed where Lenora had died, holding his wife's cold locket in one hand and Alara's small fingers in the other. His eyes were open, but looking at something Alara could not see, some far country, some place beyond the mountains. Then he turned to her, and for a moment his gaze sharpened, focused, became the gaze of the father she knew, the man who could read the weather in the way the aspens turn their leaves, who could find his way through a trackless forest by the moss on the north side of the trees. "Alara," he said. His voice was a whisper, dry as paper. "Listen to me now. If you ever go up to the ridge, whisper Wind Ridge. Find the stonemason's hearth. I made him a promise, little one. Remember the hearth. She did not understand. Papa, she said, and the word broke in her mouth like a dry twig. But Tobias Wynne was already gone. His hand relaxed around the locket, and the small stone pendant slipped free and lay on the rough wool blanket between them. The forget-me-not sealed inside like a secret kept too long. Elara was 9 years old, and she was alone. The town buried them side by side in the small cemetery behind the white church, under a pair of wooden crosses that Tobias's friends from the lumber company had made from clear-grained ponderosa pine. The minister read from the book of Psalms, and the wind carried his words away over the valley, and that was the end of the life Elara had known. She was sent to live with her father's only remaining family, his older sister Martha and her husband Harlan Holt. They lived in a larger house on the other side of town, a house with 4 rooms and a proper porch and glass in every window. It was a house of ledgers and schedules, of meals served at precise times and accounts balanced to the penny. Harlan Holt was a man who had once owned a share in a small mining operation and who now managed the books for the Consolidated Lumber Company. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who believed that discipline was the highest virtue and that sentiment was an indulgence the world could not afford. He was not, by any measure, a cruel man, not in the way that word is usually meant. He did not strike Elara. He did not shout at her. He did not lock her in closets or deny her food. What he did was something quieter and, in its way, more damaging. He simply failed to see her. In Harlan Holt's world, every person was an entry in a ledger, an asset or a liability, a credit or a debit, and an orphan niece with no inheritance and no prospects was a heavy entry on the debit side. Martha was different, but only by degrees. She was a thin woman with her brother Tobias's strong jaw, but none of his warmth. She kept a clean house. She cooked adequate meals. She made sure Elara had clothes that fit and shoes that did not leak. But there was a tightness to her, a perpetual pinch around her mouth, as though kindness were a finite resource that had to be carefully rationed. She had married Harlan young, and over the years she had slowly taken on the shape of his values the way a tree takes on the shape of the prevailing wind. She was not unkind. She was simply unable to be kind in any way that cost her anything. It was in their house that Elara learned the texture of loneliness, not the dramatic loneliness of songs and stories, not the howling, romantic isolation of a soul cast out upon the moors. This was a smaller, meaner thing. It was the loneliness of sitting at a dinner table where no one asked you about your day. It was the loneliness of sleeping in a narrow cot in a room that had been a sewing closet, knowing that you were there because there was nowhere else to put you, and no one who wanted you enough to make room. It was the loneliness of hearing your aunt and uncle speak about you in the next room in the flat. Practical tones they used to discuss the price of feed corn or the cost of repairing the barn roof. "The girl needs new boots," Martha would say, and the word girl landed on the floor like a coin dropped from a height. "How much?" Harlan would reply. And that was how Elara learned what she was worth. Not in love or laughter or pine cones placed beside her plate. In dollars and cents. In the careful, merciless arithmetic of people who could not afford to care. She did not blame them. That was perhaps the saddest thing of all. She was a child, and children will forgive almost anything if it means they can stay. So she made herself small. She made herself useful. She did her chores before she was asked. She mended the clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She tended the chickens, collected the eggs, swept the floors, and carried the water. She moved through the Holt house like a ghost, present but unseen, necessary but uncounted. And she found Silas Cobb. Silas Cobb was the town's carpenter and coffin maker. He lived in a small workshop behind the lumber mill, a building that leaned slightly to the east as though it had grown tired of standing straight and had decided to rest against the wind. The workshop was a single room, not much larger than the Holt's kitchen, but it contained a universe. Every wall was lined with tools, hand planes, chisels, saws, spokes halves, draw knives, mallets, and clamps. Each one hung in its precise place on wooden pegs, each one sharpened and oiled and ready. The floor was covered in a permanent carpet of wood shavings that curled like fallen leaves, and the air smelled of cedar and oak and the sweet, warm scent of sawdust that has been warmed by the sun coming through a dusty window. Silas himself was a man of few words and many silences. He was perhaps 50 years old, though he might have been 60. It was hard to tell with men like him, men who had been weathered by work the way fence posts are weathered by seasons. He was lean and angular, with a long face, deep-set eyes the color of a winter sky, and hands that seemed to understand the secret language of wood, the way a musician's hands understand the language of strings. His wife had died 11 years ago, consumption, the slow kind, and he had buried her in a coffin he built himself from black walnut, joined with dovetails so tight you could not see the seams. He had not remarried. He had not sought company. He lived with his tools and his wood and his silence, and the town left him to it because the town needed coffins and bookshelves and door frames, and Silas Cobb made the best ones anyone had ever seen. Elara found him by accident, or perhaps by the kind of gravity that draws like to like. She was 10 years old, walking past the lumber mill on an errand for Martha, when she heard the sound of a hand plane moving across a board. It was a sound she knew. Her father had used a hand plane to smooth the kitchen table, and it stopped her in her tracks the way a familiar song will stop you in the middle of a crowded street. She stood in the open doorway of the workshop, watching. Silas was planing a length of white oak, his long arms moving in smooth, even strokes. The shavings peeling away from the blade in thin, translucent curls that caught the light like gold leaf. He did not look up. He knew she was there. A man like Silas always knew. But he did not acknowledge her. He simply continued his work, letting the rhythm of it speak for itself. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. On the fourth day, Silas stopped planing, looked at her for a long moment with those winter sky eyes, and reached beneath his workbench. He brought out a small block of basswood, pale and soft and clean-grained, and a well-worn whittling knife. The knife was a beautiful tool. Its blade was 4 inches of dark Sheffield steel, honed to a razor's edge that caught the light like a sliver of ice. Its handle was smooth, aged cherry wood, worn by years of use to fit a hand the way a river stone is worn by water, perfectly, inevitably, as though it had always been that shape. He placed the block and the knife on the bench in front of her. He did not speak. He did not explain. He simply showed her. He showed her how to hold the knife, not gripped in a fist like a weapon, but cradled in the palm, the thumb braced against the back of the blade for control. He showed her how to read the grain of the wood, how to find the direction it wanted to go, how to work with it instead of against it. He showed her how to make the long, clean cuts that peeled away the wood in fragrant curls, and the short, precise paring cuts that defined an edge or a curve. He showed her the difference between the tight, dense grain of oak, which resisted the blade like a clenched jaw, and the soft, forgiving grain of pine, which gave way almost eagerly. He taught her the sturdiness of a mortise and tenon joint, 2 pieces of wood locked together with nothing but precision, and the simple elegance of a dovetail, those interlocking fingers of wood that held fast without a single nail. Under his silent tutelage, over the months and years that followed, Elara learned. She learned to build a 3-legged stool that did not wobble on an uneven floor. She learned to fletch an arrow so that it flew true and straight in the mountain wind. She learned to carve a small, perfect wren from a scrap of scrap wood, every feather defined, every line of the tiny body alive with the suggestion of flight. Silas never offered praise. He would look at her finished work, run his thumb slowly over a smooth joint or a clean edge, and give a single slow nod. That was all. One nod. No words, no smile, no pat on the back. That nod was worth more to Elara than any ribbon or certificate or word of compliment she had ever received or would ever receive. It meant she had met the standard. It meant the work was honest. It meant she existed, not as a line in someone's ledger, but as a craftsman, a maker, a person who could take a rough block of nothing and turn it into something that had not existed before. Sometimes, in the quiet stretches between work, Silas would talk. Not often, not much, but occasionally, while sharpening a chisel or sorting through a pile of rough-cut lumber, he would let fall a sentence or two about the old days, about the men he had known and the things he had built. "I knew a stonemason once," he said one afternoon, not looking at Elara, but at the chisel in his hands. turning it slowly in the light. Finest hands in the territory could lay a wall so true you'd swear God had drawn the line. We built something together, he and I, a long time ago. He paused, and something moved behind his eyes. Some memory, some old weight. He built things to outlast himself, Silas said quietly. That's the only kind of building worth doing. He did not say the stonemason's name. He did not say where they had built, or what they had built, or what had become of it. And Elara, who had learned from Silas that patience was a tool as important as any chisel, did not ask. But she remembered. She remembered the way Silas's voice changed when he spoke of the stonemason, a softening, a warmth that he kept locked away the rest of the time. And she remembered her father's words, spoken in the fever haze of his last night on earth. The stonemason's hearth. Remember the hearth. Two men speaking of the same ghost, and she did not yet know it. The whittling knife eventually became hers. Silas did not present it with ceremony. There was no speech, no occasion. One evening, after she had finished carving a small fox, curled in sleep, its tail wrapped around its nose, every hair suggested by the finest of cuts, Silas picked up the fox, held it to the light, and set it down on his workbench beside the knife. Then he stood, put on his coat, and walked to the door. "That knife knows your hand now," he said, without turning around. "No sense in it learning another." And he walked out into the evening, leaving her alone with the fox and the knife, and a feeling in her chest that she could not name, but that felt like standing on solid ground for the first time in years. The knife became her most prized possession, more than the locket, which was memory. The knife was possibility. It was a tangible link to the only person in the world who had ever looked at her and seen not what she had lost, but what she was capable of building. For 9 years, Elara lived in the quiet corners of the Holt house, and for 9 years she made the walk to Silas Cobb's workshop whenever she could steal an hour from her chores. She grew from a thin, watchful child into a young woman, still thin, still watchful, but with a new quality that was hard to name. It was a stillness, a centeredness, the quality of a person who has found one true thing in a world of uncertainties and has built herself around it like a tree growing around a stone. But as she approached her 18th birthday, the atmosphere in the Holt house changed. It darkened the way the sky darkens before a storm. Slowly at first, and then all at once. Harlan's investment in a new sawmill, a venture he had sunk every spare dollar into, borrowing heavily against the house, had failed. The machinery was defective. The timber rights he had been promised turned out to be contested by a larger company in Denver. Within 6 months, the investment was worthless, and Harlan Holt was a man drowning in debt. Martha's face, always tight, became a permanent mask of pinched worry. Meals grew smaller. The conversations behind closed doors grew louder. And Ilara, who had spent 9 years developing the survival instinct of a creature that lives in another creature's den, felt the shift in the air the way an animal feels the change in barometric pressure before a storm. The ledger was unbalanced, and Harlan was looking for ways to lighten the load. 3 months before her 18th birthday, Ilara opened the small wooden box where she kept her mother's locket, the riverstone pendant with the forget-me-not inside, and found it gone. She searched the box, searched her cot, searched the small sewing closet that served as her room. The locket was not there. It was not anywhere. She went to Martha, who was kneading bread in the kitchen with the mechanical efficiency of a woman whose hands had learned to work independently of her heart. "Aunt Martha," Ilara said, and something in her voice, a quietness, a control, made Martha's hands stop moving. "Where is my mother's locket?" Martha did not look up. Her hands remained pressed into the dough, motionless, as though she were holding something down. "Your uncle needed it," she said. Her voice was flat, stripped of everything except the bare fact. "For the debt. He took it to Pruitt's pawn shop 3 months ago." The words landed in the small kitchen like stones dropped into still water. Ilara stood very still. She felt something inside her chest. Not breaking, because the thing that might have broken had been reinforced by 9 years of careful, quiet survival, but shifting, settling, the way a foundation settles when the ground beneath it finally gives way. "It was my mother's," she said. "I know what it was," Martha said. And now she did look up, and there were tears on her cheeks, which surprised Ilara because she had not known that Martha Holt was capable of tears. "I know what it was, Ilara, and I am sorry. But we did not have a choice." There is always a choice, Ilara thought. But she did not say it. There was no point. The locket was gone. Her mother's stone, her mother's flower, her mother's single quiet request. "Remember me." Sold for whatever Pruitt's pawn shop would give for a piece of polished river rock and a dead flower pressed inside. She turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word. The day after her 18th birthday, the final transaction was completed. Ilara woke early, before the sun, as she always did. She swung her legs off the narrow cot, and her feet touched not the bare floor, but canvas. Someone had placed a satchel on the floor beside her cot during the night. She knew what it was before she opened it. She had been expecting it the way you expect weather, not the specific day, but the certainty that it will come. Inside the satchel were her few spare clothes, neatly folded. Her second dress, patched at the elbows, a pair of wool stockings, a flannel shirt that had once been Harlan's, cut down to fit her. And at the bottom, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, the whittling knife Silas had given her, the cherrywood handle, the Sheffield steel blade. They had packed it for her. They had touched it, handled it, placed it in the satchel alongside her threadbare clothes, as though it were just another item on the inventory of a departing guest. The thought of Harlan's hands on that knife, the hands that had sold her mother's locket, made something tighten in Ilara's jaw. She dressed in the dark. She pulled on her worn leather boots, lacing them tight. She picked up the satchel and walked into the kitchen. The house was silent. The bedroom door at the end of the hall was closed. On the kitchen table, centered precisely as though placed with a ruler, was a folded note and 2 silver dollars. The note was written in Martha's hand, precise, emotionless, each letter formed with the careful penmanship of a woman who had been taught that good handwriting was a moral virtue. It read, "You are of age now, Ilara. It is time for you to make your own way. We cannot provide for you any longer. This is for the best." Ilara read the note once. She set it down on the table, exactly where it had been. She picked up the 2 silver dollars. They were heavy in her palm, cold from the night air. $2, the sum total of 9 years of swept floors and mended clothes and collected eggs and swallowed silence. She did not cry. She did not knock on the closed bedroom door to plead or argue or ask why. She knew why. She had always known why. The arithmetic was simple. She was a cost that could no longer be borne, a line item that had been erased. She shouldered the satchel, walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the cold air of a March morning in the Colorado mountains. She did not look back. The air was cold, but it felt clean. It felt like the first breath after being underwater. She stood on the porch of the Holt house for a moment, feeling the weight of the satchel on her shoulder and the weight of the 2 silver dollars in her pocket and the strange, enormous lightness of having nothing left to lose. Then she walked. She walked through the quiet streets of Cutter's Hollow as the town was just beginning to stir. The smell of wood smoke curling from chimneys. A dog barking somewhere behind the general store. The distant sound of an axe splitting kindling. She felt like a ghost moving through a world that was no longer hers. She had lived here her entire life, and not one window she passed belonged to someone who would notice she was gone. But before she reached the edge of town, she stopped. She turned off the main road and walked down the narrow lane that led to the lumber mill and past it to the small, leaning workshop where Silas Cobb had spent his life turning wood into meaning. The workshop was dark. The door was closed and latched from the outside. Ilara put her hand flat against the rough plank door. The wood was cold under her palm. "He's been poorly since November," said a voice behind her. She turned. It was the mill foreman's wife, a heavy woman in a flour-dusted apron, standing in the doorway of the house across the lane. took to his bed after the first snow. Don't think he's been out of that workshop since January. Don't think he's got long, if I'm being honest." She paused, looked at Elara with a mixture of pity and curiosity. "You're the Holt girl, aren't you? The one who was always over here." "I'm the Wynn girl," Elara said quietly. "I was always the Wynn girl." The woman blinked, shrugged, and went back inside. Elara stood at the closed door of the workshop for a long time. She wanted to go in. She wanted to sit beside Silas the way her father had sat beside her mother, holding a hand, being present for the leaving. But the door was latched and the windows were dark, and she did not know if Silas was inside or if he had been taken somewhere else. And the foreman's wife had already gone in, and there was no one left to ask. So she did the only thing she could think to do. She reached into her satchel and took out the last carving she had made. A small wren, no bigger than her thumb, carved from a scrap of cherry wood that Silas himself had given her. Every feather was defined. Every line of the tiny body was alive with the suggestion of flight. It was the best thing she had ever made, and she had made it for him. And she had been carrying it in her satchel for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment to give it to him. She set the wren on the doorstep, where he would see it if he ever opened the door again. Then she walked away. The Cutter's Hollow Municipal Office was a small, dusty room in the back of the land office building. A room that smelled of old paper, stale tobacco, and the faintly sour odor of ink that has been sitting in a well too long. A single window let in a rectangle of gray morning light, illuminating a desk piled high with ledgers and land surveys and tax rolls and the accumulated paperwork of a town that was slowly being forgotten by the wider world. Behind the desk sat Mr. Abernathy. He was a thin man of indeterminate age, with a green eye shade pulled low over his forehead, ink-stained fingers, and the permanently weary expression of a person who has spent his entire career recording the transactions of other people's lives without ever having much of one himself. He looked up when Elara entered, peered at her over a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, and waited. "I'm looking for property," Elara said. "Abandoned property, something with back taxes owed." Abernathy studied her for a moment, this young woman with the canvas satchel and the determined set to her jaw, and the calloused hands that did not match her age. He sighed, the long, slow sigh of a man who has seen too many desperate people walk through his door, and pushed his spectacles up his nose. He pulled a large, leather-bound ledger from the shelf behind him, its spine cracked, its pages soft with age. He opened it and ran a thin finger down a column of entries: foreclosures, tax-delinquent properties, abandoned lots, each one a small story of failure or flight or death, recorded in Abernathy's precise slanting hand. "There's not much," he said, his voice flat and factual. "A few worthless plots of alkali flat down by the river. Wouldn't grow weeds. There's a 1/4 acre of scrub land on the south road. No water, no access. And there's the old Merritt place up on Whisperwind Ridge." He looked at her over his glasses, and something in his expression changed. Not pity exactly, but something adjacent to it. Caution, perhaps. The caution of a man who is about to sell someone a ticket to a place he would not go himself. "You don't want that one, miss," he said. "Been empty 20 years or more. Roof's half gone, chimneys clogged, and folks around here say it's an unlucky spot." He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under even his modest weight. "Anson Merritt built it. Stonemason. Came from back east. Married a girl named Elith. They went up there to live away from the noise of the world," he said. "Had 2 good years." He paused. "Then she died. Childbirth. Baby died too. And Anson, well, he just stopped. Stopped working. Stopped eating. Stopped coming to town. Someone went up to check on him the following spring and found him sitting in his chair by the hearth, dead. Looked like he'd just sat down and decided not to get up again." Abernathy closed the ledger halfway, keeping his finger on the page. "Town's owned the property ever since. Took it for back taxes. Nobody's ever been willing to pay what's owed on it. Nobody wants to live in a dead man's sorrow." He named a sum. It was not large by the standards of the world, but it was impossibly large by the standards of Elara Wynne, who had $2 silver and no prospects, and no one in the world who would lend her a penny. "I have $2, she said. Her voice was steady, not defiant, not pleading, just steady. The voice of a person stating a fact. Abernathy stared at her for a long moment. His ink-stained fingers drummed once on the ledger, then stopped. He looked at her calloused hands, her worn boots, the satchel that held everything she owned in the world. He looked at the ledger, at the long overdue account of the Merritt property, a number he had to write down every year, an annoyance, a reminder of a dead man and a cursed cabin, and a debt that would never be collected. He dipped his pen in the inkwell. He scratched out the old numbers. He wrote in his precise, slanting hand, "Paid in full, $2. He sanded the ink, tore the deed from the ledger along its perforated edge, and pushed it across the counter. "It's yours," he said without looking up. "The luck of it, good or bad, is your own business now." Elara picked up the deed. It was a single piece of heavy paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, with the official seal of the county stamped in faded blue ink at the bottom. She folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, next to her heart. Then she walked out of the municipal office, turned north, and began to climb. The road out of Cutter's Hollow ran straight for about a mile, following the river, the gravel crunching a steady rhythm under her worn boots. The valley was broad here, the land flat and open, with fenced pastures on either side where cattle stood in small groups, their breath making clouds in the cold morning air. The mountains rose on all sides, their lower slopes dark with timber, their upper reaches white with snow that would not melt for months. Then the main road curved east, following the river toward the next town, and Elara left it. She turned onto a smaller track. barely more than a pair of ruts cut into the earth by wagon wheels that had not rolled over them in years, that branched north and began to climb into the high country. This was the old logging road that led up toward Whisper Wind Ridge. The journey was a slow, deliberate ascent into solitude. The landscape shifted around her as she climbed. The neat farms and fenced pastures of the valley floor gave way to rough meadows of brown winter grass, then to dense stands of blue spruce and ponderosa pine that closed in on both sides of the track like the walls of a corridor. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth and the faint, clean smell of snow from the peaks above. Elara was a keen observer, a habit taught by Silas, who believed that you could learn everything you needed to know about a place or a person or a piece of wood by simply paying attention. She noted the way the moss grew thickest on the north side of the tree trunks, a natural compass that never lied. She saw the tracks of a mule deer that had crossed the path not an hour before, the pointed hoof prints clear in the soft earth, the stride suggesting a doe, unhurried, unafraid. She heard the high, thin cry of a red-tailed hawk circling above the tree line, riding the updrafts with its wings spread wide, and she watched it for a moment, envying its freedom and its height and its perfect indifference to the small struggles of the creatures below. The physical reality of her journey was stark. The canvas satchel, which had felt light enough when she left the Holt house, grew heavier with every mile, the strap cutting into her shoulder through her thin coat. A blister was forming on her left heel, a hot, liquid pain that pulsed with every step. Hunger was a dull ache in her stomach, an ache she had grown accustomed to over the years in the Holt house, where meals were adequate but never generous, and where seconds were not offered. She stopped once, beside a fast-running creek that cut across the path in a shallow ford. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache when she cupped her hands and drank. She sat on a mossy boulder, the sound of the creek filling the silence around her, and took out Silas's whittling knife. She ran her thumb along the smooth cherrywood handle, feeling the familiar contours, the slight depression where Silas's thumb had rested for decades before hers. The weight of it in her hand was a small comfort in a vast and indifferent wilderness. She was not afraid. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. And besides, she had lived with something worse than fear for 9 years. She had lived with irrelevance, with the knowledge that she could disappear and the world would not pause to notice. Fear, at least, meant you had something left to lose. What she felt instead was something harder to name. A profound and hollow sense of being untethered. A boat cut loose from its mooring, drifting on an unknown sea. She had no destination except a pile of rotting logs on a mountain that nobody wanted. She had no plan except survival. She had no one expecting her, no one worrying about her, no one who would come looking if she fell and broke her leg on this lonely track and lay there until the cold took her. She was in the most complete and literal sense, on her own. She closed the knife, put it back in the satchel, and stood up. The blister on her heel screamed. She ignored it and walked on. She walked for most of the day. The sun arced slowly across the sky, its light filtering down through the dense canopy in shifting, dappled patterns that moved across the forest floor like the shadows of fish in a stream. By late afternoon, the track grew steeper and rockier, winding between granite outcroppings that thrust up from the earth like the bones of the mountain breaking through its skin. The trees thinned. The wind picked up. And then she emerged from the dense timber onto the open expanse of Whisperwind Ridge. The wind that gave the place its name was a constant, steady presence, not a gust or a gale, but a continuous exhalation, a breath that never paused, whispering through the tall brown grasses and the stunted, gnarled pines that clung to the rocky soil with the tenacity of things that have learned to survive by refusing to let go. The view was immense. To the south, the valley of Cutter's Hollow spread out below her like a map. The river, a silver thread. The town, a scattering of dark shapes. The farms, a patchwork of brown and white. To the north and west, mountains upon mountains, rank after rank, fading from green to blue, to purple, to the faintest suggestion of white at the edge of the sky. And there, set back against a sheer granite cliff face, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the mountain itself, was the cabin. It was exactly as Abernathy had described it. A small, forgotten shape against the immense backdrop of the mountains, looking more like a part of the landscape than something built by human hands. It seemed to have grown there the way a boulder grows, slowly, inevitably, without anyone's permission. It was a place of profound silence, broken only by the wind. Elara stood there for a long time, her satchel hanging from her aching shoulder, her left heel raw and throbbing, her stomach empty, her hands cold. She stood and looked at the cabin, at the sagging roof and the crumbling walls and the dark, empty window that stared back at her like a blind eye. Her new life, her only option, her $2 home. She did not feel despair. She had used up her capacity for despair years ago in a sewing closet in the Holt house, and what had grown in its place was something harder and more useful. A stubbornness, a refusal to be erased, a quiet and ferocious determination to exist on her own terms, even if those terms were a ruined cabin on a cursed mountain with nothing but a knife and an empty stomach and 2 hands that knew how to build. She shifted the satchel on her shoulder, set her jaw against the wind, and walked toward the cabin. Toward home. The cabin was 16 feet by 20. She paced it off that first evening, heel to toe, the way Silas had taught her to measure when no ruler was at hand. 16 by 20. The size of a room that most people in Cutter's Hollow would have used for storing grain or hanging venison. The size of the sewing closet and the kitchen in the Holt house put together, and not much more, but it was hers. She pushed open the heavy plank door, hand-hewn, 2 inches thick, hung on iron hinges that groaned like something waking from a long and troubled sleep, and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Not the smell of rot, though there was some of that. Damp wood, mildewed cloth, the sour tang of animal droppings. What she smelled most was absence, the cold, mineral scent of stone that has not been warmed by fire in 20 years. The dry, papery smell of dust that has settled and resettled in undisturbed layers, season after season, until it has become a kind of sediment, a geological record of neglect. And beneath it all, faint and ghostly, the lingering memory of wood smoke. Anson Merritt's last fire, burned 2 decades ago, still whispering in the stone. The interior was a single room. A thick layer of dust and dead leaves covered everything. The floor, the rough-hewn table in the center of the room, the 2 chairs pushed against it, one upright, one overturned on its side, as though someone had stood up quickly and never bothered to right it. A rope-strung bed frame leaned against the far wall, its mattress ticking long since rotted away, the ropes sagging and frayed. A few wooden pegs protruded from the log walls, holding nothing. A small shelf near the door held a tin cup, a rusted iron ladle, and a glass bottle that had turned purple with age. But it was the hearth that drew her eye. It occupied the entire north wall of the cabin, and it was, without question, the finest piece of masonry Ilara had ever seen. It was built of massive flat slabs of native granite. Some of them must have weighed 200 pounds or more, fitted together so perfectly that you could not slip a knife blade between them. The firebox was deep and wide, lined with fire brick that was still sound. The mantel was a single slab of stone, unadorned, its surface smooth as glass. The chimney rose straight and true above it, each stone placed with a precision that spoke not just of skill, but of devotion. This was not the work of a man building a fireplace. This was the work of a man building an altar. Ilara ran her fingers along the seam between 2 stones. Not a gap, not a wobble, not a crack. She thought of what Silas had said about the stonemason he once knew. Finest hands in the territory. He built things to outlast himself. This hearth would outlast everything. It would outlast the cabin, the ridge, perhaps even the mountain itself. It was the kind of work that made you believe that human hands, for all their fragility, could leave a mark on the world that mattered. The heart of the home, cold now for 20 years. Waiting, she slept that first night on the floor, on a bed of pine boughs she gathered from the trees behind the cabin, cutting them with Silas's knife and layering them thick enough to keep the cold of the earth from seeping into her bones. She wrapped herself in the thin blanket from her satchel and lay in the darkness, listening to the wind outside, the constant sighing voice of Whisper Wind Ridge, and the smaller sounds beneath it, the skittering of mice in the walls, the creak of old timbers settling, the faint rhythmic drip of water somewhere she could not see. She was cold. She was hungry. She was alone in a dead man's house on a mountain that no one visited, with no food, no fire, and no certainty that the roof above her would hold through the night. She slept deeply and without dreams. It was the first night in 9 years that she had slept in a room that belonged to her. The next morning, she began. Her first priority was fire. Without fire, she would freeze. Without fire, she could not cook, could not boil water, could not dry her clothes when they got wet, could not see when the sun went down. Fire was not a comfort. Fire was survival. She climbed onto the roof, carefully testing each shake before putting her weight on it, and found what she expected. A family of swallows had built a nest in the top of the chimney. A dense wad of mud and grass and twigs that blocked the flue completely. She cleared it out by hand, pulling away the dried mud in chunks. The swallows long gone to their winter grounds. Then she lowered herself back down and swept the firebox with a bundle of pine branches, clearing out 2 decades of soot and debris and the desiccated remains of what she hoped was a squirrel and not something larger. She gathered tinder, dry pine needles, birch bark stripped in thin papery sheets from a fallen tree, a handful of dead grass. She built a small fire in the firebox, starting with the tinder, adding twigs, then larger sticks, then a split section of deadfall pine she had broken over her knee. She struck the flint against the steel spine of Silas's knife. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th strike, a spark caught the birch bark, and a thin curl of smoke rose from the tinder like a question mark. She blew on it, gently, steadily, the way Silas had shown her. Not too hard, not too soft, feeding the flame with breath, the way you feed a conversation with silence, giving it just enough space to grow. The fire caught. It climbed through the tinder, found the twigs, embraced the sticks, and began to crackle. The chimney drew. After 20 years of cold silence, the chimney drew. The smoke rose straight and true up through the flue and out into the morning air, a thin white plume against the gray sky, visible for miles. Anson Merritt had built his chimney well. The draft was perfect, not too strong, not too weak, pulling the smoke upward with the steady, invisible hand of physics and craftsmanship working together. Elara sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the hearth and watched the fire burn. The heat reached her face first, then her hands, then her chest, spreading through her body like a word of encouragement spoken at exactly the right moment. The stone of the hearth began to warm, releasing that faint ghost scent of old fires, old evenings, old lives lived in this small room. She thought of Anson Merritt sitting in this same spot, watching this same hearth, the fire reflecting in his eyes. She thought of Elith beside him, her face lit by the flames, alive and whole and unaware of what was coming. She thought of her own mother, Lenora, kneeling before the fireplace in the little house in Cutter's Hollow, stirring a pot of bean soup with a wooden spoon, humming a tune that Alara could almost but not quite remember. She fed another stick into the fire. The flames leaped and crackled, and the cabin, for the first time in 20 years, was warm. For the first few weeks, Elara's life was a cycle of pure survival and relentless labor. The days were short. It was still early spring in the high country, and the sun dropped behind the western peaks by 5 o'clock, plunging the ridge into a cold blue twilight that lasted only minutes before true darkness fell. She rose with the first light and worked until she could no longer see her hands in front of her face. Her first task after fire was shelter. The roof was the most urgent problem. The cedar shakes. Hand split, she could see the tool marks. Had been good shakes once, thick and straight-grained, but 20 years of mountain weather had cracked and curled and displaced them. The ridgepole, a single massive timber that ran the length of the cabin's peak, had cracked near its center, causing the roof to sag like the back of an old horse. Rain and snowmelt had been getting in for years, and the damage was visible everywhere. Dark stains on the log walls, a patch of soft wood near the northeast corner, where the moisture had begun its slow, patient work of destruction. Using Silas's knife and a small axe she found in the corner of the cabin, rusted, its handle cracked, but the head still sound once she knocked the rust off with a stone and fitted a new handle from a seasoned oak branch. She went to work. She felled a standing dead cedar about a quarter mile from the cabin, choosing it the way Silas had taught her, looking for a tree that had died on its feet, its wood dried by wind and sun while still standing, which meant it would be straight-grained and free of the rot that attacked wood lying on the ground. She notched it with the axe, working from both sides,
the way her father had shown her,
and brought it down in a controlled fall that landed it exactly where she wanted it, across 2 boulders that would serve as a natural sawhorse. Then she split it. This was the hardest work she had ever done. Splitting cedar shakes was a task usually performed by grown men with heavy froes and wooden mallets weighing 8 pounds or more. Alara had neither. What she had was a crude mallet she fashioned from a section of oak branch, a set of wedges she carved from the same wood, and a stubbornness that bordered on the geological. She placed the first wedge against the end grain of the cedar log, raised the mallet, and struck. The impact jolted through her arms and into her shoulders. The wedge bit into the wood perhaps 1/4 of an inch. She struck again, and again, and again. By the end of the first day, she had split 12 shakes. Her hands were raw, blistered across every pad and along the base of each finger. Her shoulders ached with a deep, bone-level pain that made it difficult to lift her arms above her head. She had not eaten since the previous day, when she had chewed on a piece of dried pine bark that tasted like turpentine and despair. But she had 12 shakes, and 12 shakes was a start. She spent 4 days splitting shakes and 2 days on the roof, pulling the old, ruined shakes free and fitting the new ones in their place, working from the ridgepole down, each shake overlapping the one below it by exactly 3 inches, the measurement Silas had taught her for proper water shedding. She could not repair the cracked ridge pole. That would require a timber too heavy for her to lift alone. So she sistered it, bolting a second beam alongside it using wooden pegs she carved and fitted into drilled holes. It was not elegant, but it was sound. It would hold. With each shake she nailed down, using nails she had pulled from the old shakes, straightened with the flat of the axe, and driven back in. She felt something shift inside her. Not happiness, exactly. Something more fundamental. A sense of authorship. She was writing her name on this place. Not in ink, but in labor, in sweat, in the slow accumulation of competence applied to chaos. Next came the chinking. The original chinking between the logs, a mixture of mud, moss, and animal hair, had crumbled away in dozens of places, leaving dark gaps through which the mountain wind blew freely, turning the cabin into something closer to a cage than a shelter. Elara mixed new chinking from clay she dug from the creek bank below the cabin, combining it with dry grass and green moss, working it into a thick, sticky paste with her bare hands. Then she forced the paste into every gap, every crack, every space between the logs where the wind came through, pressing it deep with her fingers, smoothing it flat, sealing the cabin one handful at a time. The work was slow. Each gap required her to mix a fresh batch of clay, carry it to the wall, pack it in, smooth it, and move to the next. Her hands were perpetually stained brown, her fingernails cracked and broken, her knuckles raw from scraping against the rough bark of the logs. But with each sealed gap, the single room grew less drafty. The fire's heat stayed longer. The cabin grew warmer at night and quieter, and more like the thing she was building it to be, a home. She did not rush. Silas had taught her that rushing was the enemy of craft, that a joint made in haste would fail under stress, that a cut made without thought would ruin a piece of wood that could never be uncut. She applied this principle to everything she did. Each shake was measured before it was placed. Each batch of chinking was mixed to the same consistency. Each nail was driven straight and true, with no wasted blows. She was not building a shelter. She was building a life, and she intended to build it right. The discovery came on a cold, rainy afternoon in her 3rd week at the cabin. The sky had been low and gray since morning, a solid ceiling of cloud that pressed down on the ridge like a hand pressing down on a lid. The rain was steady and cold, not a downpour, but a persistent, patient drizzle that found every remaining gap in the roof and exploited it. Elara had spent the morning patching the last few leaks, wedging scraps of cedar bark under the shakes where the water was coming through, and by early afternoon, she had done what she could and retreated to the fire. She sat on the floor in front of the hearth, her back against the log wall, watching the flames and listening to the rain on the roof. Her roof, repaired by her hands, holding against the weather. The sound was deeply satisfying, the way the sound of a well-tuned engine is satisfying to a mechanic, or the sound of a perfectly struck chord is satisfying to a musician. It was the sound of competence. She was stretching her legs toward the fire when she felt it. A slight movement under her right foot, a barely perceptible rocking, like a loose floorboard, except that the cabin had no floorboards. The floor was packed earth. She shifted her weight and felt it again. It was coming from the hearthstone, the massive flat slab of granite that formed the floor of the hearth directly in front of the firebox. She pressed down with her boot. The stone moved. Not much. A fraction of an inch at most. But it moved. It was a flaw, a tiny imperfection in the otherwise masterful stonework. Every other stone in the hearth was set as firmly as if it had grown there, locked in place by weight and precision and the invisible mathematics of a master mason's eye. But this one stone, this single slab, perhaps 3 feet by 2 feet, an inch and a half thick, rocked almost imperceptibly when she pressed on its edge. It bothered her. It bothered her the way a crooked picture frame bothers a certain kind of person, the way a squeaky hinge bothers a carpenter, the way an out-of-tune string bothers a fiddler. It was wrong. It did not belong in work this good. And she decided, on that cold, rainy afternoon with nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, to fix it. She needed to lift the stone, add sand or gravel beneath it to level the bed, and reset it. A simple task. She found a sturdy branch of deadfall oak, about 3 feet long and 2 inches thick, and wedged one end under the edge of the hearthstone, using a smaller stone as a fulcrum. She leaned on the branch. The hearthstone did not move. She leaned harder, putting her full weight on the lever, pressing down with both hands, and then lifting her feet off the ground so that every pound of her body was focused on that single point of leverage. The stone shifted, grudgingly, slowly, like something that did not want to be disturbed. She heard the scrape of granite against sand, felt the branch bend under the strain, and for a moment she thought it would snap. Then, with a low, grinding groan that seemed to come from the mountain itself, the hearthstone lifted. She caught the edge with her fingers and walked it up, tilting it on its side like a trapdoor, her muscles straining, her teeth clenched, the tendons in her neck standing out like cords. The stone was heavy, far heavier than she had expected. It took every ounce of her strength to hold it upright, and when she finally managed to lean it against the side of the firebox, she was breathing hard, her arms trembling, sweat running down her temples despite the cold. She looked down into the space the stone had covered. She had expected sand, a bed of builder's sand, leveled and packed. the foundation for the hearthstone. And there was sand, but not just sand. In the center of the sand bed, clearly and deliberately placed, was a shallow depression. And in that depression, wrapped in oilcloth that had been folded with the precision of a man who understood that what he was protecting needed to last, was a small tin box. Elara's heart, which had been beating a steady rhythm of labor and effort for weeks, gave a sudden sharp thump. She knelt on the packed earth floor, the rain drumming on the roof above her, the fire crackling in the firebox beside her, and reached into the hollow with both hands. The tin box was the size of a cigar box, its lid pressed tight but not locked. The oilcloth had done its work. The tin was dry, untouched by moisture, as clean as the day it had been placed there. She lifted it out of the hollow and set it on the floor in front of her. She opened the lid. The contents were simple, but they made her gasp. On the bottom of the box, stacked in 4 neat columns of 5, were 20 gold double eagle coins. Each one was a 1-ounce piece of government gold, stamped with the face of liberty on one side and an eagle in flight on the other. They gleamed in the firelight with the deep, warm luster of metal that has been kept from air and moisture, as bright as the day they were minted. 20 double eagles, $400 in gold. Beside the coins, rolled tightly and secured with a piece of twine, was a sheath of banknotes, crisp, uncirculated bills from the First National Bank of Denver, an institution that had ceased to exist 15 years ago. The bills were still legal tender, worth perhaps another $100, $500 total, a fortune. More money than Harlan Holt had lost in his sawmill venture. More money than Tobias Wynn had earned in any 3 years of his life. More money than Elara had ever seen, or imagined seeing, or dared to dream of holding in her calloused, clay-stained hands. But it was not the money that made her gasp. On top of the coins, placed with obvious care, were 2 other objects. The first was a single, perfectly smooth, egg-shaped stone about the size of a robin's egg, its color a deep, luminous green, like the color of a river pool in summer, where the water runs over moss-covered rocks. It was cool and solid in her hand when she picked it up, and it fit in her palm as though it had been shaped for exactly that purpose. The second object was a letter. A single sheet of heavy paper, folded in thirds and sealed with a drop of dark red wax. The wax was unbroken. No one had opened this letter in 20 years. Elara sat on the dirt floor, the rain drumming on her roof, the fire warming her face, and carefully broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. The paper unfolded with a soft crackle. The handwriting inside was strong and clear and even. The handwriting of a man who worked with his hands and understood that control was not the opposite of strength, but its truest expression. The letter read, October 12th, 1868. My name is Anson Merritt. I am a stonemason by trade, and I built this cabin with my own hands for my wife, Elith. We came to this ridge to build a life away from the noise of the world. We had 2 good years here, the happiest of my life. She is gone now. The baby, a girl we would have named Lily, went with her. I have buried them on the hill, overlooking the creek, where the wild columbines grow. I carved the stones myself. It was the last work my hands will do with any love in them. This box contains all our savings, the money we had set aside to buy a small flock of sheep and to build a proper cradle. I have no use for it now. I do not know how much longer I will remain. The winter is coming, both outside and in my heart. So I am leaving this here, beneath the hearthstone, for whoever comes after me. I hope this money finds you when you are in need. I hope it helps you build something new, something that lasts. Life is a fragile thing, but a well-built wall can stand for 100 years. Build a good life for yourself. Be kind. That is all the payment I ask. The stone was Elith's favorite. She found it in the creek on our first morning here, and she carried it in her apron pocket every day after that. She said it felt like holding a piece of the river's heart. Perhaps you will find a place for it. If the world has been unkind to you, know that this cabin was built with love. Every stone I laid thinking of her. Perhaps the walls remember. I asked a friend, a woodsman in the valley, to look after this place if he could. I do not know if he will, but I trust the mountain to find the right person. Anson Merritt. Ilara read the letter 3 times. She read it slowly, her fingers tracing the strong, steady script, feeling the slight indentations where Anson's pen had pressed into the paper with the unconscious force of a man writing words that cost him something. The coins were a fortune, the means to survive, the means to buy food and tools and glass for the window and wool for a proper blanket, the means to live through the winter and the spring and the year after that. But the letter was a gift of a different kind entirely. It was a connection, a thread stretched across 20 years of silence, from a dead man's hand to a living woman's heart. Anson Merritt was no longer just a name in a clerk's ledger, a cautionary tale told by Abernathy in a dusty office. He was a man who had loved a woman named Elith, a man who had built her a home with his own hands, laying each stone with the care and precision that only love can sustain. A man who had lost everything, his wife, his daughter, his reason for living, and who, in the deepest trench of his grief, had not cursed the world or barricaded his heart, but had thought of a stranger who might come to this place someday, in need, and find what he had left behind. He had thought of her 20 years before she was born, before she existed even as a possibility. Anson Merritt had thought of her and had left her a gift. She picked up the green stone. It was cool and solid in her palm, exactly as Anson had described, like holding a piece of the river's heart. She closed her fingers around it and felt something settle in her chest. something that had been loose and rattling and untethered ever since she walked out of the Holt house with a satchel and $2 silver. And then her mind caught on a phrase in the letter, the way a sleeve catches on a nail. I asked a friend, a woodsman in the valley, to look after this place if he could. A woodsman in the valley. Her father had been a woodsman. Tobias Wynne had worked the timber in Cutter's Hollow for 20 years. He would have been a young man in 1868, 20 years old, new to the valley, just starting his life. He could have known Anson Merritt. He could have been the friend Anson wrote about. And then the other memory came, rising up from the deep place where she had kept it for 9 years, preserved in the amber of childhood grief, like a fossil in stone. Her father's voice, dry as paper, the last words he ever spoke to her, the stonemason's hearth on the ridge. I made him a promise, little one. Remember the hearth, the stonemason's hearth, this hearth, this stone she was sitting beside, this fire that was warming her face with the heat of a dead man's masonry. Her father had known. Tobias Wynne had known about Anson Merritt, about the cabin, about the promise. He had known, and he had carried that knowledge for years, and on his deathbed, in the fog of fever, he had tried to pass it to his 9-year-old daughter, the only inheritance he had left to give. Not money, not land, a sentence, a direction, a promise he had made to a ghost. Remember the hearth. And she had, without understanding why, without knowing what it meant. She had carried those words for 9 years in the back of her mind, like a key to a lock she had never seen. And now, sitting on the dirt floor of a cabin she had bought for $2, with a dead man's gold in her lap and a dead man's letter in her hands, the key had finally found its lock. She was not here by accident. She was not here because she had nowhere else to go. She was here because her father had sent her. Because Anson Merritt had trusted the mountain to find the right person. And the mountain, through grief and fever and a child's imperfect memory, had done exactly that. Elara Wynne wept. She wept for the first time since leaving the Holt house. She wept not for herself, not for the blister on her heel, or the hunger in her stomach, or the 9 years of loneliness in a sewing closet. She wept for Anson Merritt, who had loved and lost, and still had the grace to think of someone else. She wept for Elith, who had found a green stone on her first morning in a new home and had carried it in her pocket every day, not knowing how few days she had left. She wept for Tobiah, who had kept a dead man's secret for years and had tried, with his last breath, to pass it to his daughter. She wept for Lenora, whose locket was gone, sold by a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing, She wept for all of them, and when she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, put the letter back in the tin box, closed the lid, and placed it on the rough table beside the fire. Then she stood up, squared her shoulders, and began to plan. The money changed everything, but not in the way one might expect. Elara did not pack her satchel, walk down the mountain, and buy a ticket to Denver or San Francisco, or any of the other places where a young woman with $500 in gold could start over in comfort. She did not abandon the cabin or the ridge or the work she had already begun. The thought did not cross her mind. Not because she lacked imagination, but because Anson Merritt's legacy was not just wealth. It was a charge. Build a good life for yourself. Be kind.
That is all the payment I ask.
He had not written, "Leave this place." He had not written, "Take the money and go." He had written, "Build." And she intended to honor that word. The next morning, she walked the long way back down to Cutter's Hollow. Her steps were lighter than they had been on her journey up, though the trail was the same. The rocks were the same. The blisters were the same. Something had shifted in her center of gravity. She was no longer walking away from something. She was walking towards something, and the difference was enormous. She went first to the general store, a place she had only ever looked at through the window during her years with the Holts. A dim, cluttered cathedral of commerce that smelled of coffee beans and leather and kerosene and the sharp, clean scent of new rope. She bought carefully, deliberately, the way Silas would have bought, not with the frantic relief of a person spending found money, but with the focused intention of a person making investments. Sacks of flour, dried beans, salt, and coffee. A new cast iron skillet, well seasoned, heavy as a promise. A warm wool blanket, thick enough to stop the cold. A small crate of glass panes for the cabin window, each one wrapped in newspaper and packed in straw. Linseed oil for the wood. A proper hammer and a box of cut nails. And a bag of oats, because she had seen deer trails near the cabin and knew that where there were deer, there might someday be a horse. And if there was a horse, it would need oats. And thinking ahead was something Silas had taught her was never wasted. She paid with a single gold double eagle and received her change without flinching at the store owner's raised eyebrows. Then she walked to the blacksmith shop at the end of the main street, a low building of rough stone that radiated heat like a living thing, its double doors standing open to the cold air, the sound of hammer on anvil ringing out with the steady, musical rhythm of a man who had been doing the same work for 30 years.
Jebediah Forge was a bear of a man, 6'4", broad as a barn door, with forearms the size of fence posts, and a beard that had gone from black to iron gray without anyone noticing. He wore a leather apron scorched with 100 burn marks and moved around his forge with the surprising grace of a man who was completely at home in his own body. He looked up when Elara entered, his small, dark eyes taking in everything. The calloused hands, the worn boots, the straight back, the jaw set with purpose. She placed a gold double eagle on the anvil. "I need an axe head," she said. "Forged, not cast, and a set of pry bars, one 18 inches, one 3 feet. And if you can make me a froe for splitting shakes, I'd be grateful." Jebediah Forge picked up the gold coin, examined it, bit it once out of professional habit, and set it back down. Then he looked at Ilara's hands, really looked at them, the way a craftsman looks at another craftsman's tools, and saw the blisters, the clay stains, the calluses that were just beginning to form in the places where they would eventually become permanent. "That cabin up on the ridge," he said. It was not a question. "That cabin up on the ridge," she confirmed. He nodded, one slow nod, the nod of a man who respected work and recognized a worker. "I'll have them ready by week's end," he said. "The froe I'll throw in. Nobody's asked me to make a froe in 10 years, and I've been wanting to." With proper tools and supplies, the rebuilding began in earnest. The work was no less difficult, but it was now imbued with a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. She was not just repairing a ruin. She was resurrecting a home. She spent a full week carefully reglazing the window. She mixed her own putty from linseed oil and chalk dust, working it to the consistency of bread dough, and set each pane of glass into the window frame with the patience of a woman setting stones in a mosaic. The first morning that the sun rose over the eastern peaks and streamed through clear glass into the cabin, filling the single room with a warm, golden light that touched the hearth and the table and the floor and made them glow. It felt like a small miracle, like the cabin itself was surprised to see the sun again. She used the pry bars to level the sagging porch, jacking up the frame and replacing the rotted planks with new ones she milled from a fallen pine, planing them smooth with the draw knife she had found hanging on a peg in the cabin wall, its blade still sharp beneath a skin of rust. She re-chinked every log, inside and out, until the cabin was a fortress against the wind, sealed tight, the air inside warm and still, even when the gale howled across the ridge. She swept the chimney clean, climbing onto the roof with a bundle of pine branches tied to a rope and lowering it down the flue, scrubbing the soot from the stone with a patience that Silas would have recognized. The first fire she lit in the clean chimney drew so perfectly that the smoke rose in a straight, unwavering column of white, visible from the valley floor, a signal that the dead place on the ridge was dead no longer. And slowly, one by one, the community found her. They did not come with casseroles and condolences and the practiced sympathy of church committees. This was not that kind of place, and these were not those kind of people. They came because work recognizes work, and skill recognizes skill. And in a hard country where survival depends on competence, a person who can build a straight wall and split a clean shake and set a proper chimney is a person worth knowing. Jebediah Forge came first.
He rode up one afternoon on a thick-legged draft horse, leading a mule loaded with the tools he had made. The axe head fitted to a hickory handle he had shaped himself, the pry bars and the froe, which was a beautiful piece of work. The blade forged from a piece of old wagon spring and ground to an edge that sang when you ran your thumb along it. He dismounted, tied the horse to a pine, and stood in front of the cabin with his massive arms crossed, looking at what she had done. He looked at the new shakes on the roof, laid in straight, even courses. He looked at the porch, level and solid. He looked at the chinking, smooth and uniform, already beginning to dry to the color of the native stone. "You do good work," he said. It was the same phrase, almost word for word, that Silas would have used. And like Silas's nod, it was not small talk. It was a professional assessment offered by one craftsman to another, and it was worth more than any compliment a person who did not work with their hands could ever give. Before he left, he noticed her struggling to sharpen the old axe she had salvaged from the cabin. He took it from her hands without asking, pulled a file from his saddlebag, and with a few practiced strokes put an edge on it that could shave the bark off a pine knot. He handed it back, nodded once, and rode away without asking for anything in return. A week later, Hattie Gable appeared. She was a widow in her 60s who lived on a small farm at the base of the ridge, a woman as tough and weathered as a fence post, with white hair pulled back in a tight bun and hands that were never idle. She climbed the trail to the cabin with a basket on her arm and a pace that would have shamed women half her age. The basket contained a loaf of fresh sourdough bread, its crust dark and crackled, its interior soft and sour and perfect, a crock of butter she had churned that morning, and a small glass jar of sourdough starter, a living thing, a culture that had been growing and dividing and being fed and tended for longer than Hattie could remember. "A house isn't a home without the smell of bread baking," she said, handing Alara the basket. She looked around the cabin with bright, appraising eyes and saw the stacked firewood, cut to uniform lengths, split clean, piled in neat courses against the south wall. She saw the small herb garden Alara had planted near the door, thyme and sage and wild mint, transplanted from the meadow, each plant bedded in soil she had enriched with ash from the fire. Hattie Gable began making the climb once a week, not out of pity, out of respect, and out of a loneliness of her own that she would never have admitted to, but that Alara recognized, because it takes one to know one. Then there was Bridger Calloway. He was a young trapper, 22 years old, who worked the high country above the ridge, running a line of beaver sets along the creeks and selling the pelts to a buyer in town. He was a quiet, competent young man with sun-darkened skin and the unhurried movements of a person who spends most of his time alone in wild places. He had lost his wife the previous winter, influenza, swift and merciless, and he was raising a 4-year-old daughter, a solemn, dark-haired child named Willa, with the bewildered tenderness of a man who has no idea what he is doing, but is determined to do it anyway. Bridger appeared one afternoon while Alara was trying to hoist a new mantelpiece above the hearth, a
a single massive piece of fire-cured oak she had found in a deadfall grove, dried and seasoned by years of wind and sun. Its grain so tight and dense it rang like a bell when she tapped it with her knuckle. The old stone mantel Anson had placed was solid but cracked, and she wanted something above it. A shelf, a place to set things, a frame for the hearth that was the heart of the home. The timber was 8 feet long and weighed more than she did. She had rigged a rope and pulley from the ceiling beam and was trying to lift it into position single-handed. The rope burning her palms, the timber swinging and stubborn. Bridger walked out of the tree line, saw what she was doing, and without a word, walked over and took the other end. Together, they muscled the oak beam into place above the hearth, setting it on 2 iron brackets she had bolted into the log wall. When it was seated, level and true, Bridger stepped back and looked at it with the same quiet appreciation that Jebediah had shown for the roof. Elara made him a cup of chicory coffee. The real thing was too expensive. And they sat on the porch, not talking much, watching the sun go down over the valley in bands of gold and copper, and the deep, bruised purple that only exists in mountain skies. He told her where to find chanterelle mushrooms after a rain, under the big spruces on the north-facing slopes, where the soil was dark and rich. She showed him a better way to tie a snare knot, a technique Silas had taught her, using a slip loop that tightened under tension without binding. Community, Elara was learning, was not built with words or invitations or the formal machinery of churches and town councils. It was built with shared effort, with a hand on the other end of a heavy beam, with a basket of bread carried up a mountain, with a file drawn across an axe blade by a man who asked for nothing in return. It was built, like everything worth building, one joint at a time. But not everyone in the valley wished her well. Elara learned this 3 months after finding the tin box, on a warm afternoon in early summer, when Hattie Gable climbed the trail with her weekly basket and a look on her face that Elara had not seen before. A tightness around the eyes, a set to the jaw that spoke of something more than the usual effort of the climb. "Sit down, child," Hattie said. "I have something to tell you, and you're not going to like it." Harlan Holt, it seemed, had heard. Not about the gold. Elara had been careful, spending it slowly, a single coin at a time, always in town, never making a show of it. What Harlan had heard was simpler and, to a man like him, more provocative. He had heard that the orphan niece he had discarded was thriving, that the cabin on the ridge, which he had assumed would kill her or drive her back, begging, was repaired and occupied and beginning to look like a real home. And he had heard from the land agent who represented the Continental Lumber Company out of Denver that the timber rights along Whisperwind Ridge were becoming valuable. Very valuable. Harlan Holt had gone to Abernathy. He had stood in the same dusty office where Elara had stood, had leaned over the same counter, and had made a claim. The sale of the Merritt property for $2, he argued, was not a valid transaction. Elara had been his ward. She had been under his legal guardianship until her 18th birthday. The sale had taken place on the morning after her birthday, true, but had she been of sound mind? Had she been coerced? Had the clerk performed his due diligence? Abernathy had refused to void the deed. The old clerk was many things, tired, cynical, underpaid, but he was also meticulous, and his records were unimpeachable. The sale was legal. The deed was valid. The property belonged to Elara Wynne, but Harlan had not stopped there. He had written to a lawyer in Denver, inquiring about the possibility of a formal challenge. He had spoken to the Continental lumber agent about the potential value of the timber rights. He was building a case, slowly, patiently, the way a man like Harlan Holt did everything, with the cold, methodical precision of an accountant who believed that every problem was, at its root, a math problem. "He wants the land," Hattie said, her voice flat with contempt. "Not the cabin, not you, the trees. The lumber company is paying $15 an acre for timber rights on the ridge, and your parcel sits right in the middle of the best stand of old-growth ponderosa in the territory." Elara sat on the porch, the cup of chicory coffee growing cold in her hands, and felt the old familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet. She had built something here. She had repaired the roof and sealed the walls and planted a garden and made a place for herself in a world that had no place for her.
And now the man who had sold her mother's locket and turned her out with $2 was coming to take it away.
She looked out across the valley at the long blue shadows of the mountains stretching east in the late afternoon light, and she thought about what Silas had told her once, years ago, while they sat in his workshop sharpening chisels. "Wood doesn't fight the blade," he had said. "It doesn't need to. It just is what it is, hard or soft, green or dry, straight or crooked. And a good craftsman doesn't fight the wood either. He reads it, he understands it, and then he works with what he's got." Elara set down her coffee and stood up. She would not fight Harlan Holt with lawyers and ledgers. That was his world, his language, his terrain. She would fight him the only way she knew how, with her hands, with her work, with the truth of what she had built. But first, she had one more journey to make, one more door to open, one more loss to face. She needed to go back to Cutter's Hollow. She needed to find Silas Cobb. She walked down the mountain in the early morning, before the sun had cleared the eastern peaks, while the valley below was still filled with blue shadow, and the air was cold enough to turn her breath to mist. The trail was familiar now. She knew every rock, every root, every place where the path narrowed between boulders and the footing
Grew uncertain. She had walked it a dozen times since buying the cabin, carrying supplies up and carrying carvings down.
And her body knew the rhythm of it the way a musician's hands know the keys of an instrument they have played for years. But this walk was different. This walk had weight. She had not been to Silas Cobb's workshop since the morning she left Cutter's Hollow. That morning, was it only 5 months ago? It felt like 5 years. She had stood at his closed door, learned from the foreman's wife that he was sick, and left a small carved wren on his doorstep. She had walked away because she had no choice, because there was nothing she could do, because the world was pushing her out the door of her old life and she had to go. But the truth, the harder truth, was that she had also been afraid. Not of what she might find inside the workshop, of what she might not find, of the empty space where Silas had been, and of what that emptiness would mean, that the last person in the world who had seen her, truly seen her, was gone. She reached Cutter's Hollow by mid-morning. The town looked the same. It always looked the same, these small valley towns, changing so slowly that a person who left for 20 years would recognize every building, every fence post, every rut in the road. The general store, the land office, the saloon with the crooked sign, the white church with its bell tower, the blacksmith's shop, already ringing with the sound of Jebediah Forge's hammer. She turned down the narrow lane past the lumber mill. The mill was running, the high whine of the circular saw cutting through the morning air. The smell of fresh-cut pine sharp and sweet. She walked past it, her boots crunching on the sawdust that covered the lane like snow, and stopped in front of the small, leaning workshop at the end. The door was still closed. The latch was still fastened from the outside, exactly as it had been 5 months ago. The small carved wren she had left on the doorstep was gone. She stood there for a moment, one hand resting on the rough plank door. The wood was warm under her palm. The morning sun had been on it for an hour, and she could feel the grain through her calluses, the way Silas had taught her to feel, reading the wood by touch as much as by sight. She lifted the latch and pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Not the smell she remembered, not cedar and oak and warm sawdust and the sweet tang of linseed oil. This was a different smell, the smell of a closed room, of dust and stillness and the faint, unmistakable scent of absence. The scent of a place where someone had been and was no longer. The workshop was exactly as she remembered it and completely different. The tools were still on their pegs. Every hand plane, every chisel, every saw and spokeshalve and draw knife in its precise place. Each one clean, each one oiled, each one ready for a hand that would never reach for it again. The workbench was clear, its surface scarred and stained with decades of use, swept clean of shavings. The floor, usually carpeted with curls of wood, was bare, and on the workbench in the center, where a piece of work in progress would normally sit, were 2 objects. The first was the small carved wren. Her wren. The one she had left on the doorstep. Someone had picked it up. Silas himself, she realized. He must have found the strength to open the door one last time and placed it on the workbench, where it sat on the smooth, scarred wood, with its tiny head tilted to one side, as though listening for a sound that had stopped.
The second object was a box. It was a small box, perhaps 8 inches long and 6 inches wide and 4 inches deep, made of black walnut. The joinery was flawless, dovetails at every corner, cut so precisely that the seams were nearly invisible, the pins and tails interlocking with the mathematical perfection that only comes from a lifetime of practice. The lid was fitted so closely that it sealed with a soft, pneumatic hiss when it was pressed down, like a whisper. On the top of the lid, carved into the dark wood with clean, confident cuts, was a single word, Elara. She picked up the box. It was heavier than she expected. She ran her thumb over the carved letters of her name, feeling each cut, the depth and angle of the chisel work, and she recognized the hand. She had spent 9 years learning to read the marks that different tools left in different woods, and she knew Silas's hand the way she knew his nod, by the precision of it, the economy, the absence of anything unnecessary. He had made this for her. He had known she would come back, and he had made this for her. And he had placed it beside the wren she had left him, and then he had... what? Gone to his cot in the back of the workshop? Pulled the blanket up? Closed his eyes? She opened the box. Inside, nestled in a lining of soft doeskin, was a set of carving tools. 6 chisels of graduated sizes, from 1/4 inch to 1.5 inches, each one hand-forged and hand-ground. Each handle turned from a different wood: cherry, walnut, maple, birch, oak, ash, so that she could identify each tool by touch alone, in the dark, by the feel of the handle in her hand. A small gouge with a sweep that was perfect for carving the curve of a bird's wing. A V-tool for fine detail work, its edge so sharp it caught the light like a thread of silver. These were not new tools. They were Silas's tools, his best tools, the ones he had kept in a leather roll behind his workbench, the ones he used for his finest work. The carved rosettes on a coffin lid, the fluted columns on a mantelpiece, the small, perfect birds and foxes and deer that he carved in the long winter evenings when the snow was too deep to walk and the world had shrunk to the size of a single room. Beneath the tools, folded once, was a letter. It was written in pencil on a piece of paper torn from the back of a lumber ledger, the lines faint but steady, the handwriting recognizable but smaller than she remembered, as though the effort of forming each letter had cost something. Elara, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come back. And both of these things are as they should be. I have kept a secret from you. I am not sorry for keeping it, because it was not mine to tell, and because telling you would not have changed anything except to rob you of the chance to find it for yourself. I knew Anson Merritt. He was my friend, the closest thing to a brother I ever had. We were young men together in this valley, and we built that cabin on the ridge with our own hands. He did the stone, I did the wood. The door you walked through, I hung. The window frame, I made. The roof beams, I cut
and fitted. The hearthstone, the chimney, the foundation, that was all Anson. The finest stonework I have ever seen, before or since. When Elith died, and the baby with her, I watched Anson disappear into himself. I rode up to the ridge every week for 3 months, and each time he was less there, less present, less alive. I could not reach him. No one could. He had gone to a place inside himself where the door was locked and there was no key. I stopped going. I am not proud of that. I told myself it was because the trail was bad in winter, because I had work to do, because a man has a right to his grief. But the truth is that I stopped going because I could not bear to watch him die by inches, and I was not strong enough to sit with him while he did it. They found him in the spring, sitting in the chair by the hearth, facing the fire that had long since gone cold. He looked peaceful, they said. I do not know if that is true, or if it is just what people say about the dead to comfort the living. I never went back to the ridge. I could not. Every log I had shaped, every joint I had cut, every peg I had driven, they were all still there, and she was not, and he was not, and I could not walk through that door and hear the silence where their voices should have been. But I kept my promise to him. He had asked me to look after the place, and I did. From a distance, I watched the trail. I listened for news. I waited for someone to come along who needed what was up there. Your father was that person, or so I thought at first. Tobias Wynne came to Cutter's Hollow in the spring of 1870, 2 years after Anson died. He was a young man, strong and quiet, and he took a job with the lumber company. I did not know him well at first, but one afternoon, he came to my workshop to commission a tool chest. And while I worked, we talked. He told me he had heard about the cabin on the ridge from an old trapper who had passed through Pennsylvania. He told me he had heard there was a stonemason up there who might need help. He did not know that Anson was already dead. When I told him, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "A man who builds something that good shouldn't be forgotten. If there's anything of his left up there, it ought to be looked after." I told him about the cabin, about Anson's hearth, about the promise I had made and failed to keep. And Tobias said he would go up when the time was right and see that things were in order. I do not know if he ever did. He married your mother the following year, and you came along, and life took the shape it takes. He never spoke of it to me again, but I believe he knew about the hearthstone. I believe Anson told him, or I told him. The years have blurred the details. What I know for certain is that your father understood what that cabin meant and what was hidden there, and he carried that knowledge the way a man carries a loaded gun, carefully, and with the understanding that it was meant for someone else to use. When your father brought you to my workshop for the first time, you were 10 years old. You stood in the doorway and watched me plane a board, and you did not fidget or speak or look away. You stood perfectly still and watched with the kind of attention that cannot be taught, only recognized. And I recognized it. I knew in that moment that you were the one, not because of your father or because of Anson or because of any promise, because of the way you looked at the wood, because of the way your hands moved when I gave you the knife and the basswood block, not with the clumsy eagerness of a child playing, but with the careful, patient deliberation of a craftsman meeting her material for the first time. I did not tell you about Anson. I did not tell you about the cabin or the hearthstone or the gold beneath it. I could have. There were 100 afternoons when the words were on my tongue, when it would have been the simplest thing in the world to say, "There is a place on the ridge that is waiting for you." But I did not say it, because telling you would have been charity. And charity, I have learned, is a poison that looks like water. It quenches the thirst, but weakens the muscle. A person who is given a thing does not value it the way a person who has built it does. And you deserved to build. So instead of telling you, I taught you. I taught you to read the grain and cut the joint and build the wall. I gave you craft. And craft, Elara, is worth more than any fortune hidden under any hearthstone. The gold will spend. The tools will wear. But the knowledge in your hands, the ability to look at a broken thing and see what it could become, that is yours forever, and no one can take it from you. I am proud of you. I never said it because saying it was not my way, but I am writing it now because I will not get another chance. And some things should not go unsaid, even by men who have made a habit of silence. Take care of the cabin. Take care of the hearth. Anson built it with love, and love is the only material that does not rot. Your friend, Silas Cobb. Elara sat in the empty workshop for a long time. The light moved across the floor as the sun climbed higher, shifting the shadows of the tools on their pegs. She held the letter in one hand and the smallest chisel, the 1/4 inch with the cherry handle, in the other, and she let the grief move through her the way weather moves through a valley, without resistance, without apology, without shame. Silas was gone. He had died alone in this workshop, surrounded by the tools he had spent a lifetime mastering, and no one had been with him. She had not been with him. She had been on the ridge, rebuilding the cabin he had helped build 40 years ago, using the skills he had given her, and she had not known he was dying. But he had known. He had known he was dying, and he had used his last strength not to call for help, not to summon a doctor or a minister, but to make a box, to carve her name in walnut, to write a letter that explained everything he had never said. I am proud of you. 4 words, written in pencil, in a weakening hand, on a scrap of paper torn from a lumber ledger.
4 words that filled every empty space that 9 years in the Holt house had carved in her heart.
She closed the box, tucked it under her arm, and walked out of the workshop. She closed the door behind her and latched it from the outside, exactly as she had found it. And then she turned and walked toward the other end of town, toward the house with 4 rooms and glass in every window, where Harlan and Martha Holt were waiting for her without knowing it.
She did not go to a lawyer. She did not go to the land office. She did not go to the county courthouse or the sheriff's office, or any of the places where a person with a legal claim and a bag of gold coins could mount a formal defense. She went to the Holt house and she knocked on the front door.
It was Martha who answered. She stood in the doorway in a faded blue house dress, her hair pulled back tight, her face carrying the same pinched expression it had carried for as long as Ilara could remember. But there was something else in her face now, a flicker of something that might have been surprise, or guilt, or fear, or all 3 tangled together in a knot that she could not undo. "Ilara," she said. Just the name, nothing else. "I need to speak with Uncle Harlan," Ilara said. Her voice was calm, not cold, not hard, not confrontational, just calm. The voice of a person who knows what she has come to say and does not need anger to say it. Martha hesitated, then stepped aside. The parlor of the Holt house was exactly as Ilara remembered it. The horsehair sofa with the antimacassars, the mantel clock that ticked too loudly, the braided rug on the floor that Martha beat every Saturday morning with a vigor that seemed to be directed at something other than dust. Harlan was sitting at his desk in the corner, a roll-top desk cluttered with papers and ledgers, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a pen in his hand. He looked up when Ilara walked in. His expression was harder to read than Martha's. Harlan Holt had spent a lifetime keeping his thoughts behind his face the way a banker keeps money behind a vault door. But his eyes moved quickly and involuntarily to the object Ilara was carrying. It was not the box from Silas. She had left that at the general store, wrapped in burlap, under the counter, safe. What she carried was a stool. A 3-legged stool, small enough to hold in one hand, made of white oak. Its 3 legs splayed at precise angles. Its round seat smooth and slightly dished from years of use. It was the first piece of furniture she had ever built, the very first, made under Silas's supervision when she was 11 years old. She had kept it in the Holt house, in the sewing closet that served as her room, and it had been left behind when she was turned out.
She had retrieved it from the closet on her way through the house, and now she set it on the parlor floor in front of Harlan's desk with a quiet, deliberate thump.
It did not wobble. After 9 years and a journey through a hallway and a parlor, carried by the woman who had made it as a child, it sat on the braided rug on 3 legs and did not move. Not a fraction of an inch. Not a whisper of unsteadiness. It sat the way a thing sits when it has been built right, solid, balanced, at peace with the floor beneath it and the air above it and its own internal geometry. Harlan looked at the stool. Then he looked at Alara. "I know what you're doing," she said. "Hattie Gable told me. You went to Abernathy. You wrote to a lawyer in Denver. You're trying to take the cabin." Harlan's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. He was not a man who denied things. He was a man who justified them.
"That property has value," he said. "The timber rights alone are worth more than everything I lost in the sawmill." And the sale was irregular. $2 for 40 acres is not a legitimate transaction. Any judge in the territory would see that.
"Maybe," Alara said. "Maybe a judge would look at the paperwork and decide that $2 wasn't enough. Maybe he'd void the deed and hand the land to you, and you'd sell the timber rights to Continental Lumber, and you'd pay off your debts, and you'd feel like the ledger was balanced." She paused. She looked at Harlan, really looked at him, and saw not an enemy, but a man. A frightened, failing man whose world was built on numbers and whose numbers had stopped adding up. A man who had never learned to build anything with his hands and so had built his life on paper. And now the paper was burning. "But here's what the judge won't see," she said. "He won't see the roof I shingled with cedar I split myself. He won't see the walls I sealed with clay I dug from the creek bed. He won't see the window I glazed, or the porch I leveled, or the chimney I swept clean. He won't see the 5 months of work I put into that cabin with nothing but a knife and an axe and a pair of hands that a man named Silas Cobb spent 9 years training." She pointed at the stool. "I built that when I was 11 years old, Uncle Harlan. I built it in a workshop you never visited, with tools you never saw, under the eye of a man you never spoke to. And it still stands. 9 years later, it still stands. That's what I do. I build things that stand." Harlan's eyes moved from the stool to Alara's hands. Her calloused, scarred, clay-stained hands. The hands of a woman who had spent 5 months turning a ruin into a home. "Every person in Cutter's Hollow knows what I've done on that ridge," she said. "Jebediah Forge knows. Hattie Gable knows. Bridger Calloway knows. Abernathy knows. They've seen the work. They'll testify to it. And when the judge asks who rebuilt that cabin, who lived in it, who bled for it, who made it a home again after 20 years of nothing, the answer won't be Harlan Holt. The answer will be me." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The words were not weapons. They were facts, plain and solid. The way a good joint is plain and solid. No ornament, no decoration, just wood meeting wood at the angle it was meant to meet. "You taught me that I was a debt," she said quietly. "A number in your ledger. A cost to be managed and eventually erased. And maybe that's all I was to you. But Silas taught me that I was a craftsman. And Anson Merritt, a man who died 20 years before I was born, left me a letter that said, 'Build a good life. Be kind.
That is all the payment I ask. She picked up the stool. I'm building, Uncle Harlan, and I'm not going to stop because your numbers don't add up. The room was silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Harlan Holt sat at his desk, his pen still in his hand, his reading glasses still pushed up on his forehead, and he looked at his niece. He looked at her for a long time, longer than he had ever looked at her in 9 years of sharing a house, and something moved behind his eyes. Not softness, exactly. Harlan Holt was not a soft man, and never would be, but something adjacent to recognition. The dim, uncomfortable awareness that the line item he had erased was standing in front of him, fully realized, fully formed, and built of materials he did not possess and could not purchase. He looked at the stool in her hand. He looked at her jaw, set in the same line as Tobias's jaw, his dead brother-in-law, the man whose daughter he had turned out with $2 and a note. He put down his pen. He opened the top drawer of his desk, took out a folded piece of paper, the letter he had drafted to the lawyer in Denver, and tore it in half. Then he tore the halves in half again and dropped the pieces in the wastebasket beside his desk. He did not apologize. He did not say he was wrong. He did not offer an explanation or an excuse or a word of regret. Harlan Holt was not capable of those things, and Elara did not expect them. What he did was enough. He destroyed the weapon, and in doing so, he conceded the field. Elara nodded, one slow nod. Silas's nod. Then she turned to leave. She was in the hallway, her hand on the front door, when she heard footsteps behind her. Quick, light footsteps, not Harlan's heavy tread. Elara, wait! Martha stood in the hallway, one hand pressed against the wall as though she needed it for support. Her face was different now. The pinch was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. Something that had been locked away for years behind the mask of practicality and was now breaking through. In her other hand, she held a small object. Elara looked at it and felt the air leave her lungs. It was the locket. Her mother's locket. The polished riverstone pendant with the white quartz vein running through it like a frozen river hung on its thin, braided cord. The locket that Gerald had sold to Pruitt's pawn shop 3 months before her birthday. The locket that held a single pressed forget-me-not. The locket that was the last physical connection to a woman who had asked only to be remembered. How? Elara said. Just the one word. Martha's chin trembled. Her eyes were bright with tears she was fighting to hold back and losing. I sold my wedding ring, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. 2 months ago. I went to Pruitt's and I sold my ring, and I bought the locket back. I've been carrying it in my apron pocket ever since, waiting for...
I don't know what I was waiting for you to come back, for the courage to bring it to you, for some sign that I hadn't ruined everything beyond repair." She held the locket out, her hand shaking. "It should never have left you," she said. Elara took the locket. The stone was cool in her palm, smooth, familiar, the same weight, the same shape, the same quiet solidity it had always had. She pressed the tiny copper hinge with her thumbnail, and the locket opened, and there, inside, was the forget-me-not. Pale blue, pressed flat, perfect, preserved in the dark for years, asking its single, patient question. "Remember me?" She looked at Martha, her aunt, who was not a brave woman, who was not a strong woman, who had married a man made of ledgers and had let him turn her into a page, but who had done this one thing, this small, secret, costly thing, and who was standing in the hallway now with an empty ring finger and a face full of grief, asking
For nothing. Elara put the locket around her neck. She felt it settle against her collarbone, the familiar weight of it, the cool stone warming slowly against her skin.
She looked at Martha and gave her a nod. One slow nod. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness was a thing that would have to be built over time, like a wall, one stone at a time, and they were not there yet. But acknowledgement, recognition, the nod that says, "I see what you did. I see what it cost you, and I am not going to pretend it doesn't matter." Martha's hand dropped to her side. She did not reach for an embrace. She did not say anything more. She simply stood in the hallway of the house that was no longer Elara's prison and watched her walk out the front door and into the morning light. Elara climbed back up to Whisperwind Ridge with the box of Silas's tools under one arm and her mother's locket around her neck and a feeling in her chest that she could not name, but that felt like the moment after a long rain stops and the first shaft of sunlight breaks through the clouds and touches the wet earth and everything, every leaf, every stone, every blade of grass gleams. She had one more thing to do before the day was over. She had read Anson's letter a dozen times, and each time her eyes had stopped on the same passage. "I have buried them on the hill overlooking the creek, where the wild columbines grow. I carved the stones myself. It was the last work my hands will do with any love in them." She found the hill. It was behind the cabin, a gentle rise that climbed to a small clearing above the creek. The creek ran below, fast and clear over smooth stones, making the sound that water makes when it has been running over the same stones for 1,000 years. Not a rush, not a roar, but a continuous liquid murmur, like a conversation conducted in a language just beyond the edge of understanding. The columbines grew here, as Anson had said they would. They were wild, untended, growing in clusters among the rocks and the tall grass. their flowers a deep blue violet with white centers, nodding on thin stems in the constant wind of the ridge. They grew thickest around two stones that stood upright in the grass side by side, spaced a foot apart. Grave markers, hand-carved granite, each one about 2 feet tall, their surfaces weathered, but their inscriptions still legible. The carving was beautiful, the same steady, precise hand that had built the hearth, the same understanding of stone, the same love expressed through craft. The first stone read, Elith Merritt, beloved wife, 1843 to 1868. She made every room she entered warmer. The second, smaller stone read, Lily Merritt, born and lost, October 8th, 1868. Our flower. Elara knelt in the grass between the columbines and read the inscriptions and felt the weight of them. Not the weight of sorrow, though there was sorrow in them, deep and old, but the weight of love, the kind of love that carves stone, the kind that lays every brick of a hearth thinking of the person who will warm herself beside it, the kind that leaves gold under a hearthstone for a stranger, asking only for kindness in return. She reached into her pocket and took out the green stone, Elith's stone, the one she had found in the creek on her first morning on the ridge, the one she had carried in her apron pocket every day, the one Anson had called a piece of the river's heart. Elara placed it at the base of Elith's grave marker, nestling it into the grass where it would catch the light of the morning sun. Then she reached into the satchel and took out a small cloth bundle. Inside were forget-me-not seeds. She had collected them from a patch growing wild near the creek below the cabin, recognizing the small blue flowers immediately, their color the exact shade of the pressed flower in her mother's locket. She planted them around the graves, pressing the tiny seeds into the soil with her thumbs, covering them gently with earth. Lenora's flower, growing on Elith's grave. Two women who had never met, connected now by blue petals, and a daughter who carried one woman's locket and lived in the other woman's home. Connected by the thread that runs through all stories of loss and love and the stubborn human refusal to let either one be the end. She stood, brushed the soil from her knees, and looked out over the valley. The sun was low now, the shadows long, the light the color of honey. Cutter's Hollow was a scatter of dark shapes in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys, the white church steeple catching the last of the light. Somewhere down there, Harlan Holt was sitting at his desk, staring at the torn pieces of a letter. Somewhere down there, Martha was standing in her kitchen, looking at her bare ring finger. Somewhere down there, in a workshop that leaned slightly to the east, Silas Cobb's tools hung in their places on wooden pegs, waiting for hands that would never reach for them again. But here, on this hill, with the wind whispering through the columbines and the creek murmuring below, and the graves of a stonemason's wife and daughter keeping their long silence, Elara Wynne felt something she had not felt since she was 9 years old, standing in a 2-room house that smelled of bread
and linseed oil, with her mother's hand braiding flowers into her hair. She felt home.
The second winter came early. By the end of October, the first snow had fallen on Whisper Wind Ridge, a thin, white dusting that melted by noon, but left the message clear. The mountain was closing its doors, and anyone still on the ridge had better be ready. Elara was ready.
The cabin was transformed. The roof was tight, the walls were sealed, the floor, which she had laid herself, planing each board from pine logs she had felled and split and dried, was smooth and level and covered with a braided rug she had made from strips of old wool blankets. The window gleamed with clear glass, and in the mornings, the sun poured through it and filled the room with light that touched the walls and the hearth and the neatly organized shelves, and made everything glow with a warmth that was not just physical, but spiritual. The warmth of a place that is cared for. The hearth was the center of everything, as it had always been. Anson's stonework, cleaned and repointed, radiated heat with the steady, generous warmth of stone that has been properly laid and properly maintained. The chimney drew perfectly. The firebox held a fire that burned clean and hot, filling the cabin with the scent of pine and cedar and the deep, primal comfort of flame.
Above the hearth, on the mantelpiece of fire-cured oak that she and Bridger had lifted into place on a warm afternoon that now seemed like a lifetime ago, she had placed two objects. On the left end of the mantel sat the whittling knife Silas Cobb had given her, the Sheffield steel blade, honed to a razor's edge, the cherrywood handle, smooth and dark, worn by 2 lifetimes of use, his and hers, to a shape that fit her hand the way a key fits a lock. On the right end sat the locket, Lenora's locket, the polished riverstone with the white quartz vein, the braided cord, the tiny copper hinge, the pressed forget-me-not inside. She had taken it from around her neck and placed it there, not because she wanted to put it away, but because she wanted to see it. She wanted it to be part of the room, part of the hearth, part of the home. 2 objects from 2 people who had shaped her life more profoundly than anyone she had ever known. Silas had given her skill, the knowledge of how to read the grain, how to cut the joint, how to take a broken thing and make it whole. He had given her the understanding that value was not something you were given, but something you created, one careful cut at a time, through patient and honest work. Anson Merritt, a stranger, a ghost, a man connected to her only by a shared piece of land and a promise kept across decades, had given her means. The gold under the hearthstone, but more than that, he had given her faith. Faith that the world, for all its cruelty, contained pockets of extraordinary kindness. Faith that a man in the depths of his grief could think of a stranger. Faith that things left behind, gifts hidden in dark places,
promises whispered to the mountain, could find their way to the people who needed them most.
And Tobias, her father, who had carried a dead man's secret for years, not as a burden, but as a trust, and who had tried, with his last breath, to pass it to his daughter. Remember the hearth. 3 words, the only inheritance he had left to give, and it had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything. She thought of them sometimes, in the long winter evenings, sitting in the chair she had built, its back woven from strips of hickory bark, its seat contoured to her body, its joints tight and true and silent. She thought of Silas in his workshop, surrounded by the smell of cedar and the sound of a hand plane sliding across oak. She thought of Anson at this very hearth, firelight on his face, Elith beside him, the green stone in her apron pocket, the baby not yet coming, the sorrow not yet born. She thought of Tobias and Lenora in the 2-room house, the smell of bread, the linseed oil, the pine cones on the table, the wildflowers in her hair, all gone now, all of them, but not lost, not forgotten. They lived in the cabin, in the stone and the wood and the joints and the grain, in the hearth that held the heat, in the door that swung true on its iron hinges, in the window that let in the light. They lived in her hands, in the calluses and the scars and the knowledge that no one could take from her. They lived in the way she held a chisel, the way she read a piece of wood, the way she gave a single slow nod when a thing was done right. They lived on a cold evening in December, with the snow falling thick and silent outside and the fire crackling in the hearth. Elara heard footsteps on the porch. She opened the door and found Bridger Calloway standing in the snow, his hat pulled low, his daughter Willa in his arms, the child's face buried against his neck. "I need to run the upper trap line," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. 3 days, maybe 4. The snow's coming heavy, and I can't take her with me. He paused. I don't have anyone else to ask. Elara looked at the child. Willa was 4 years old, small for her age, with dark hair and dark eyes and the watchful, solemn expression of a child who has learned too early that the world is a place where mothers disappear. She was looking at Elara with an expression that Elara recognized in her bones, in her blood, in the marrow of her memory, because it was the same expression she had worn at 9 years old, standing in the doorway of Silas Cobb's workshop, watching a stranger work and hoping, without words, to be seen. "Come in," Elara said. Bridger set Willa down on the floor of the cabin. The child stood very still, her small hands clasped in front of her, her eyes moving slowly around the room, the hearth, the fire, the shelves of carved animals, the tools on their pegs, the window full of snow. She did not speak. She did not cry. She simply stood and looked, taking in this new place with the careful, total attention of a child who has learned that safety must be assessed before it can be trusted. Bridger left at dawn the next morning, his traps and his pack on his back, his snowshoes leaving deep prints in the fresh powder. Elara watched him go from the porch, Willa standing beside her, the child's small hand resting very lightly on the hem of Elara's coat. That first day, Elara did not try to entertain the child or comfort her or fill the silence with chatter. She simply went about her work, banking the fire, sweeping the floor, mixing bread dough with the sourdough starter Hattie had given her, and let Willa watch. The child followed her at a distance, silent, observant, her dark eyes tracking every movement with the intensity of a small animal learning the habits of a new territory. In the afternoon, Elara sat down by the fire with a block of basswood and Silas's whittling knife. She began to carve, not anything specific, just letting the blade find the shape hidden inside the wood, the way Silas had taught her. Long, clean strokes, thin curls of fragrant wood falling to the floor, the quiet rhythmic sound of the blade moving through the grain. Willa came closer. She stood at Elara's elbow, watching the blade, watching the wood, watching the shape emerge. A small bird, taking form one cut at a time. Elara looked at the child. The child looked back at her. And in that look, that still, wordless, searching look, Elara saw herself, 10 years old, standing in a doorway, watching a stranger work, hoping to be seen. She reached under the chair and brought out a small block of basswood, smooth and pale and clean-grained. She placed it in Willa's hands. Then she took the smallest chisel from Silas's set, the 1/4 inch, with the cherry handle, and showed the child how to hold it. Not gripped in a fist, cradled in the palm. The thumb braced against the back of the blade for control. "Feel the grain," she said softly. "It will tell you which way it wants to go." Willa's small fingers closed around the handle. She pressed the blade against the wood, tentatively, and a thin curl of basswood peeled away and fell to the floor. The child looked up at Elara. Her eyes were wide, not with surprise, but with recognition. The recognition of a person who has just discovered that she has hands, and that hands can make things, and that making things is a form of speech more honest than words. Elara nodded. One slow nod. Outside, the snow fell. The wind whispered across the ridge, carrying its eternal, wordless song. The fire crackled in Anson Merritt's hearth, its light painting the walls of the cabin with gold and shadow. On the mantelpiece, Silas's knife and Lenora's locket caught the firelight and held it, 2 small points of brightness in a room full of warmth. And on the floor of the cabin, a woman of 19 and a child of 4 sat together, the blade moving through the wood, the curls falling like small blessings. And the silence between them was not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of craft. The deep, productive, holy silence of 2 people making something that had not existed before. From the valley floor, If you looked up toward Whisperwind Ridge on that winter evening, you would have seen a single point of warm golden light against the dark mass of the mountain. A small light, no bigger than a star, but steady, unwavering. A light that said, "Someone is here. Someone is home. The mountain is no longer empty." Alara Wynne was 19 years old. She had arrived on this mountain with $2 silver, a canvas satchel, and a dead man's whittling knife. She had bought a ruin and made it a home. She had found a fortune beneath a hearthstone and used it not to escape, but to build. She had faced down the man who had tried to erase her, and had done it not with lawyers or money or anger, but with a 3-legged stool that did not wobble and a pair of hands that knew their worth. She had lost a mother, a father, and a teacher. She had inherited a stonemason's grief, a carpenter's craft, and a stranger's faith. She had planted forget-me-nots on a grave, and hung a locket on a mantle, and placed a green stone at the foot of a marker that read, "She made every room she entered warmer." And now she was teaching a child to hold a chisel. The circle continued. The hearth held its heat. The walls remembered. It was the best $2 she had ever spent.